Okay. Hello, good afternoon to all professors and students of UFABC for another class on the history of Palestine of our online course that has more than 1,300 subscribers and that exceeded our initial expectation. This demonstrates that the Middle East is a topic that generates a lot of interest, not only because of the situation we are going through today, but also because of the importance of the region in the international system and in international relations. As professors at UFABC, we are very concerned about what is happening in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Lebanon, with so many innocent lives lost. We long for peace to return quickly to the region so that all people can live in peace and harmony. Today, we are very happy to have with us the Palestinian sociologist and historian, Professor Salim Tamari, who is a great expert on the Middle East and Palestine. I also want to welcome my colleague, Professor Igor Fuser, who will coordinate today's class with me. Professor Igor will make the presentation of Professor Salim Tamari. Please, Professor Igor.
Good afternoon, everybody. You are welcome at the third meeting of this course on Palestinian history and culture. It's a joint initiative of the University of ABC, UFABC, and the Birzeit University at Ramallah, Palestine. Before introducing the guest of today's lecture, I would like to remember that today in Brazil, it's the Teachers' Day. And so, in my name and in the name of all my colleagues at the Institute for Arabic and Muslim Studies at the UFBC, I would like to pay homage to all the teachers and professors that nowadays in Palestine, especially in Gaza Strip, our homage to all the teachers and professors who are resisting, fighting, struggling together with their students, with the Palestinian youngsters and children, fighting for the survival and the freedom of the Palestinian nation. I would like to let you know that your struggle is an inspiration for all of us all around the world who long for freedom, peace, and justice. Now, I would like to introduce the lecturer of today's class. Professor Salim Tamari is an outstanding Palestinian intellectual, senior research associate at the Institute of Palestine Studies and an emeritus professor of sociology at the Birzeit University. He's got his Ph.D. in sociology at the Manchester University in the United Kingdom and is a visiting professor at some of the most prestigious universities in the world, such as Cornell, Harvard, Columbia, Georgetown, and the University of Chicago in the United States, and the al-Quds University in Jerusalem, in the occupied Palestine. Professor Tamari is also a member of the board of editors of the Jerusalem Quarterly, who is a very important Palestinian academic journal. And Professor Tamari is awarded with the Palestine Prize for Achievements in the Social Sciences and Humanities in the year 2018. So, I will pass, I will ask for Professor Tamari to start his lecture. Thank you, and thank you, Professor Tamari, for being with us in the afternoon.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be with you on this online occasion. And this is my first connection with UFABC, but I am very grateful for this opportunity. The title of my talk, which continues with the former intervention, is The History of Palestine from the Rebellion of 1936 to the Intifada of 1987. I will try to introduce this theme in broad form and try to make it less boring by doing selective events and interpretation of these events on the PowerPoint, which I hope your English will be able to understand my discussion. So can we start with the first slide, please? Okay, now the background to this, of course, is the great moment at the end of the First World War when Palestine was separated from the Ottoman Empire. It was part of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman state. And during the war, the Ottomans, who were allied with the Germans, lost the war against the Franco-British and Italian allied invasion of the Middle East. The terms of the settlement of the war was rested on three contradictory commitments made by the Allied powers, one of which was a kind of collaboration between the British and the Sharif of Hijaz, Mecca, the Sharif Hussein, and the understanding was called the Hussein-McMahon Agreement, by which Britain recognizes the suzerainty of the Arab forces over the Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, as well as Palestine, in return for Arab alliance with the allies against the Ottomans. The second agreement was the secret code discussed by the French and the British, secretly negotiating future control over the territories against the terms of the Hussein-McMahon Agreement, by which they divided the Middle East into two major zones. And the third contradictory agreement that occurred at the time was the Balfour Declaration, by which the British government recognized the aspirations of the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So these were three contradictory commitments given to the Arabs as a form of recognizing their independence under the leadership of Prince Faisal of Hijaz. At the same time, they allocated the region to Britain and France. If I can have the second slide to show the another one. Another slide, please. Okay, so this is the beginning of the commitment of the French and the British secretly to divide the Middle East into spheres of influence by which the French gained control over Syria and Lebanon, and the British gained control over Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. According to this agreement, which was ratified by the League of Nations, Palestine was to be an international zone under British control. And within it, the British made commitments to the Balfour Declaration, which recognized the aspirations of the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. So you could see that the separation of Palestine from the Ottoman regime and from Syria was the beginning of the formation of minor colonial states in the Middle East following the First World War. Next, please. At the same time, Palestine was the subject of substantial migration by the Jewish population escaping from pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe, and the attempt to establish colonies in Palestine, which began in earnest at the end of Ottoman regime, but continued in a very rapid form under the British. So the British made two contradictory commitments. First, to Prince Faisal to gain independence over Syria and Palestine. When I say Syria, I mean Greater Syria, and a commitment to the Zionists that Her Majesty's government recognizes the future of a Jewish national home without defining the parameters of the Jewish national home, whether it be a state, cultural autonomy, or a split kind of control with the Arab population. So that was the seeds of the conflict as it began at the turn of the 20th century. Next, please. Now, Palestine was the subject of a very large number of rebellions, which goes before the coming of the colonial powers to the Middle East, that is, under the Ottomans. Under the Ottomans, the beginning of peasant rebellions against the hegemony of the Turkish Empire and the Egyptian regime began in 1831 when Muhammad Ali Pasha, the viceroy of the Sultan in Egypt, sent his son, Ibrahim Pasha, to occupy Palestine in defiance of the Ottoman regime in Istanbul. And in 10 years, he was able to control all of Syria and parts of southern Anatolia. So Egyptian ambitions in the Middle East created what could possibly be the first sentiments of Arab independence in the region against Ottoman control. During this period, Brahim Pasha, representing the Egyptian army, was able to consolidate his regime over the whole region, which is today Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, and Palestine. And he came very close to Istanbul and overturned the Ottoman regime. At that moment, the British and the French, with their naval fleets, intervened and made sure that the Egyptians would be receded back to Egypt, and Ottoman rule will be restored to Palestine. And because of the harshness of the Egyptian regime in Palestine, there was a series of rebellions, mostly peasant rebellions, which took place in large areas of Palestine, especially in Hebron and in Nablus and in the Bethlehem region, as well as in Karak, in Transjordan. Can you hear the shooting? I think it's accompanying my talk. As well as in the Deir ez-Zor region. So there was a series of rebellions which made it very difficult for the Egyptians to control Palestine. And this was the foreclosure of resistance to all occupying powers that came to Syria and Palestine at that moment. Next, please. Now, the focus of our talk is the 1936 Peasant Rebellion. In 1936, widespread Palestinian dissatisfaction with British governors erupted into open rebellion. Several key dynamics and events can be seen as setting the stage for this uprising. Rural Palestinians were hit hard by debt and dispossession, and such pressures were only exacerbated by British policies and Zionist imperatives of land purchases, and Hebrew labor. What is Hebrew labor? It was a policy by the Zionist movement and their leadership in the Jewish Agency to create parallel economic structures in Palestine so that land purchases from absentee landlords would establish Jewish colonies, and in these Jewish colonies, they employed Hebrew labor only, to the exclusion of peasants. And this began a process of land alienation by which large estates were bought from absentee landlords, Jewish colonies were established in them, and the Arab peasants were dispossessed. They either became sharecroppers or they became landless peasants, moving to the urban centers. This created immense pressure, economic pressure, over the colonial regime, which eventually erupted in the 1935 rebellion by Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, who was a preacher from Haifa, originally from Syria, who organized bands of peasants to fight British control over Palestine. At that time, rural to urban migration swelled the region of Haifa and Jaffa, two major cities on the coastline, with poor Palestinians in search of work, and new attendant forms of political organizing emerged that emphasized youth, religion, class, and ideology over older elite-based structures. Next, please. And this is called the Great Palestinian Rebellion, and sometimes it's called the Great Arab Revolt, because it involved not only Palestinian peasants, but volunteer forces from Syria and Lebanon. It was known as the Great Arab Revolt, as this uprising came to be known, which lasted for 3 years, from 1936 to 39, and can be generally divided into 3 phases. The first phase lasted from the spring of 1936 to July 1937. The strike was widely observed and brought commercial and economic activities to Palestine to a standstill. Meanwhile, Palestinians throughout the countryside came together in armed groups to attack, at first paradoxically, but with increasing organization, British and Zionist targets. The British employed various tactics in an attempt to break the strike and to quell the rural insurrection. The ranks of British and Jewish policemen swelled, and Palestinians were subjected to house searches, night raids, beating, imprisonment, torture, and deportation. In the 3 years, about 50,000 partisans and their families were killed. During that period, the whole Palestinian leadership organized in the Arab Higher Committee was exiled, so that Palestine lost their leadership, and huge amount of armament was confiscated, and large number of houses in various rebellious villages were bombarded from the air. They used the British Air Force in an increasingly common phenomena that later happened in Asia, in India, as well as in Africa. Next, please. No, before that. The third phase of the rebellion lasted roughly from the fall of 1938 to the summer of 39. The British had appointed in January 38 another commission of inquiry headed by Sir John Woodhead to examine the technical aspects of implementing partition. At the same time, however, the British launched an all-out offensive. In 1939, more Palestinians were killed and more were executed by hanging, and nearly twice as many were detained than in 1938, which is the second year of the rebellion. Such brutality placed immense pressure on the rebels, exacerbating rifts between the political leadership of the Arab Higher Committee, exiled in Damascus, and local leadership on the ground. Eventually, the bulk of the leadership was expelled from Palestine. For some reason, the British used to send political exile to the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. And by the time the 1940s and Second World War began, Palestine had all of its political leadership outside the country. And the economy was in ruins. And the militias who were fighting the rebellions had been totally disarmed and crushed. Next, please. Now, while this was happening, the British and the Zionists began to deploy counter-insurgency tactics. At the political level, they formed something called the Farmers' Party, Hizb al-Zurra, which was established in 24 to 28 with the support from the Jewish agency in Nazareth, Nablus, and Hebron to strengthen the rural opposition to the Husseini leadership in the Arab national movement. During the rebellion, the Palestinian political structure was factionalized. There was a section of the Palestinian leadership that collaborated with the British against the rebellion. And this form of collaboration took the form of what is known as the peace bands, or in Arabic, Fayaliq al-Salam. Those were established in 1937 as an indigenous movement allied with the Defense Party, which was headed by the Nashashibi clan, headed by Mr. Raghib Nashashibi, who was mayor of Jerusalem. and they explicitly wanted to combat the rebellion of 1936 in order to reach an accommodation with the British. So these people allied themselves with the British forces, and they helped to crush the rebellion from the inside the movement. This is a very typical tactic which occurred throughout the British colonies, as well as in the French colonies. We see it also in Algeria, for example, when the French colonialists deployed peasant factions and subservient Algerian leadership, for example, in the Qabaila region, to crush the Algerian resistance to French rule. And it happened in Palestine and Syria as well. Next, please. Now, the main onslaught against the rebellion took the form of counterinsurgency. The British brought from Calcutta, from India, a man who was mainly known for working against rebellious bands in the Bengal region, in the Calcutta region. Sir Charles Taggart was an Irish engineer and counterinsurgency expert in the British colonial forces. He successfully dealt with Bengali rebellions in India, and he was brought to Palestine during that period to help crush the rebellion. In order to do that, he established a number of physical forts known as the Taggart forts. Those of you who have visited Palestine will see of the 42 forts he established, 20 of them are still functioning as administrative headquarters for the Israelis in the Israeli territories and in areas of the Palestine Authority in Nablus and Ramallah and Hebron and in several other places, including Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the fort today is the headquarters of UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Organization. So let me tell you something about these forts. Can I have the second, next, please? Okay. The Taggart forts, I lost the slides. Can we put it back? Okay, I can speak from my, yeah. There we go. Okay, this is an example of the fort from the town of Jenin. The Taggart forts were built in 42 locations in Jerusalem and throughout Palestine and acted as local administrative police stations, courthouses, broadcasting studios in the case of Jerusalem Radio, as well as a prison. They survived as the most resilient form of colonial architecture and continued to be used under Egyptian, Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli rule over Palestine. You see them in Gaza, you see them during the Egyptian administration of Gaza between 1948 and 67. They became the center of the Arafat's rule when Arafat, after the Oslo Agreement, came to Palestine. And so these were a combination of colonial forts with huge cement blocks preventing people from storming them during periods of rebellion. So this was the contribution of Charles Taggart to the counterinsurgency of the rebellion of 1936. Next, please. Now, one important feature of the crushing of the rebellion was the establishment of Royal Commission to examine what to do with Palestine as a result of the insurgency. And the most important of these commissions was the Peel Commission, which recommended for the first time the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab Palestinian state. And it goes back to that period. Next, please. Now, we had several partition schemes. The first one was the Peel Commission, which I talked about for 1937. The Woodhead Commission, which was done during the rebellion in 1938. And the most important one was the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. If you look at the map, you can see how the British tried to schematize areas for Jewish control, creating a Zionist state, and Palestinian Arab control, and a third area, which appears in orange in these maps, was first to be a continued British mandate control, but in the 47 plan, that orange area was the city of Jerusalem, which was to be internationalized and belonging neither to the Arab state nor to the Jewish state. Now, you have to remember that the 1947 partition plan was very peculiar in that the Arab state had a demographic preponderance of about 90% Palestinian Arabs versus 10% Jewish citizens, whereas the Jewish state had 45% Arab population with 55% Jews in it, which actually, giving the demographic balance, would make it untenable for such a state to survive. And as a result of the 48 war, Israel expanded into large areas of the Gaza region and the West Bank to establish demographic continuity for the Jewish forces. But most importantly, it thrust through a military operation known as the Dalit Plan to remove all the Arab population from areas which were now allocated to the Jewish state. And this was the gist of what happened during the war. The Arab population, 90% of the Arab population was kicked out of their villages, towns, coastal region, and hamlets into the various areas of Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries. Next, please. So you can see the war, which involved Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan, was a major military defeat for the Arab forces and created a huge number of refugees out of these regions. Now, you have to remember an important feature of this background, namely that the Arab forces in Palestine were heavily defeated in the rebellion of 36, 37, and 38. So the Palestinians were disarmed at the end of the rebellion. Their leadership was in the Seychelles and in Lebanon, and the economy was destroyed. So in the war of 48, the Palestinian forces were not at all matches for the Haganah, the Jewish militias, and the Stern gangs, and the Lehi groups, who were also right-wing Jewish militias. And the result was the tragedy of the refugees coming out from the 48 war. Next, please. So the gist of it was that the 48 war created the refugee issues. And the important questions raised by that war is the role of the Jordanian Arab Legion under the leadership of a British officer known as Glob Pasha. A lot has been written about internal collusion between the Jordanian leadership under King Abdullah. This is King Abdullah I, the great-grandfather of Abdullah II, and the Zionist movement led by Ben Gurion and Golda Meir. There was a kind of collusion which explains why the lines of struggle were drawn around the West Bank and later around Gaza, and why the Palestinian foretold state was crushed during that period in favor of an Egyptian administration in the Gaza district and the Jordanian administration in the West Bank and the Jerusalem region. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, there's a huge debate, which some of you may be familiar with, as what happens as a result of 1948 Nakba or debacle or catastrophe. In the Israeli historical version, the claim is that the Arabs rejected partition and lost the war. Tiny Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies and had to defend itself. And the refugee issues was created by self-inflicted exodus, claiming that Arab leaders had urged the Palestinians to leave so they can come in and establish victory. Now, this version is challenged both by Palestinian claims as to what happened, but also significantly by what is known as Israeli revisionist historiography by people like Avi Shlaim, Benny Morris, Tom Segev, and Ilan Pape. I will speak about them in a minute. In the Palestinian historical version, the partition meant that half the country would be given to a European settler community, which is unacceptable. Why should half the country be given to a settler colonial regime when the Palestinian indigenous population formed first 80% and then at the end of the mandate around 70% of the population of the country? But as we know, the war was already resolved in 1939 by Britain's disbanding of the Palestinian militias and the exile of its leadership, in addition to destroying the economy of the Arab sector. But mainly also, as both Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli new historians have proved, the exodus was created by acts of ethnic cleansing and terror over a large number of the rural areas in coastal Palestine and the inner part of the country. Next, please. So the causes of the refugee exodus was substantially a result of communal warfare in which targeted areas, targeted villages were ethnically cleansed under 3 strategic military plans, the most important of which was Plan Dalit, which the Haganah, the Israeli military forces, cleansed all the area between Jaffa on the coast to Jerusalem to make sure that there will be Jewish demographic majority. And as a result, the refugee issue became a central defining issue of the Palestinian problem. Next, please. The refugees, as the previous map showed, went to Lebanon and Syria, where they became part of large camps in the vicinity of the major cities of Lebanon and Syria, in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Deir ez-Zor, in Tripoli, in Saida, in Sur, and of course in Beirut. Jordan took a very large number of these refugees, both in the east bank of the Jordan, and Jordan, as well as in the West Bank, which was annexed to Jordan. And there, the refugee population constituted about half of the Jordanian population, which continues the case until today. In Gaza, a government of all Palestine was declared under the leadership of Haj Amin al-Husseini during the Nasser administration of the Gaza Strip, and the refugees constituted 70% of the population. And this is clear now from the current war against Gaza, which we are witnessing today, that the major target of this attack is the enclaves of refugees and refugee camps in the city, in which Israel is attempting to continue the process of ethnically cleansing the area by forcing them out of the region. In the West Bank, the number of refugees was much less. The West Bank was able to maintain some kind of structural demographic balance, and there they constituted 25% of the population. 20% of the population of Israel, first 10%, they became 18, and then 20% became Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, or as they are known sometimes as Arab Israelis, and they call themselves Palestinian Israelis. So this was the demographic situation there. Next, please. We talked about the revisionists. Next. One major feature of this is that King Abdullah, who was the king of Transjordan, who had an eye to become the king of Syria following the First World War, was only allocated to Transjordan, which was a desert kingdom, and basically consolidated his regime by annexing the West Bank to Jordan in 1949 in what is known as the Jericho Agreement. And Palestine added a strategic depth to the desert kingdom by having acquired to them a huge agricultural land and a skilled labor force. And this was the new Kingdom of Jordan, known as the East and West Bank. Next. The price of citizenship in Jordan was that the Palestinians forego any insistence on a state in return for their citizenship in Jordan. And the Hashemites were seen as the semantic block between Palestinians and Jordanians, because the Hashemites were Hijazis. They came from Arabia, and they were like the glue that cemented this bond between the Palestinians and Jordanians in the West Bank and in the East Bank. So the Israelis in the war of 67 acquired all of these regions. They acquired the West Bank and Gaza, and they began to examine what became known as the demographic territorial dilemma. What do we mean by the demographic territorial dilemma? If Israel kept control over the large area it acquired, including Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Gaza, the Jewish population in the greater Israel region would be reduced to about, at that time, 55% of the population. Today, this 55% of the population has been turned into parity. Today, in all of Palestine, that is in Israel, the West Bank, and in Gaza, the Jewish population constitutes 50% of the total population. The Arab Palestinian population is 50% of the total. So the country is demographically divided by two. And to maintain control over these territories would either result in colonial control and disenfranchisement and the kind of apartheid regime that exists today, or they would have to deal with that demography by some kind of territorial compromise. And the territorial compromise came in 1991 as a result of the Madrid Peace Conference, by which the Israeli leadership agreed to create a future autonomous regimes in the West Bank and Gaza, possibly leading to an independent state. Of course, that never happened, but this was the Israeli submission or attempt to solve the territorial demographic dilemma. And the prelude to that was the Intifada of 1987. Next, please. Here you see a map showing the area that Israel acquired in 1967 and the subsequent treaties that led to Israel maintaining control over the West Bank and Gaza after the peace agreement with Egypt in 1982. Next, please. Basically, the debate within Israel was between the defense minister, Moshe Dayan, and Yigal Allon. Dayan thought that the best thing is to keep the territories, build settlements, and allow free movement of market and labor. Allon, who was deputy prime minister, thought that one way to solve this is to return the territory of the West Bank to Jordan, minus Jerusalem, and therefore maintain a Jewish demographic majority in the Israeli state. That is, return to Israel more or less to the situation that existed in 1949. Next, please. So the Dayan version of this won, and as a result, the Israelis began a movement of intensified settlement activities, which you can see here on the map, so that by 1985, which is 2 years before the Intifada, 55% of the total land area of the West Bank came under Israeli settler control or under Israeli military control, which relegated to settlement activity. The situation became untenable. Palestinians were losing their land as they were working in Israel as day laborers. Next, please. Next, please. And one feature which echoes the 1936 rebellion was an Israeli attempt to establish a counter movement to consolidate Israeli rule, And this took the form of establishing the village leagues. They organized and militarized groups of collaborating farmers and village leaders between 1978 and 1982 in order to counter the influence of the PLO, which had undermined Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza. Mind you, at this time, there's no guerrilla activities. There was only civil disobedience. And that civil disobedience took a major turn in 1987 when an open insurrection in the form of civil disobedience took place in the camps of Gaza and then moving to the cities of the West Bank and then the rural areas. And this insurrection became known as the First Intifada. Next, please. Now, under Israeli rule, the Palestinians began to organize themselves in massive autonomous groups in which educational activity, farmers' unions, labor unions, shopkeeper strikes began to form some kind of autonomous political organization right under Israeli military rule. And this civil disobedience took organized form in 1987, in which something called the United National Leadership of the Intifada was established. And they saw themselves as the internal arm of the PLO. PLO was based first in Lebanon, in Syria, and then in Tunis. In 1982, the PLO was crushed in Lebanon by a massive Israeli attack, and the guerrillas moved from Lebanon to Tunis. And the internal leadership of the Palestinians inside the West Bank and in Gaza saw that they had to move on their own without coordinating their activities with the PLO. And that was the nature of the insurrection known as the Intifada. The Intifada was so successful, next please, was so successful that it led to creation of autonomous organs of power right under Israeli control. And the resistance took the form of disobedience, building cooperative unions, building the infrastructure of a state right within the colonial regime. Next, please. So by 1988, 89, the West Bank and Gaza became ungovernable. The Israeli police force inside the West Bank and Gaza was paralyzed. The Israelis' ability to wage taxes was paralyzed. The Israeli military control over the area made the attempt to control this rebellious population untenable. And this created the political consequences of the Intifada. Here I have a quote from the American Heritage Dictionary, by which the Intifada entered the international language, including the English language. So Intifada was defined as an uprising among Palestinian Arabs of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank beginning in the late 87 and continuing sporadically into the early 1990s in protest against continued Israeli occupation. So it became part of the lexicon of all European languages as a result of that activity. Next, please. So this is an attempt to explain 35 years later, because we had 3 intifadas since then, but this was the important civil insurrection which rendered Israeli control over the territories inoperable. And as I mentioned, it was a feeling that settlement activities had took the land from the farmers and their ability to sustain their economy, and that the leadership of the PLO was no longer able to direct events after its expulsion from Lebanon in the Israeli invasion in 1982. Next, please. The objective of the Intifada, as enunciated by the leadership, was to dismantle the apparatus of military control by sustained call to civil disobedience. It took the form of mass resignation of the police force and the civil administration of the territories. It was the most successful form of civil disobedience, one of the most successful in the 20th century. The reaction to this was swift and brutal. They closed the sites of incitement, they closed the universities, they closed the schools, they led to mass imprisonment and deportation, as it happened in the rebellion of 1936 to 39. Next, please. So the result of that was the International Peace Conference in Madrid and the subsequent negotiations of a very problematic agreement known as the Oslo Accords of 1993, by which the Israelis conceded that the West Bank and Gaza will become autonomous territories, and by 1996 they will begin to discuss the final status. And of course that never happened, because the Oslo Accords basically was heavily designed in favor of Israeli continued control over the territories, even though they gave some kind of autonomous control to the Palestinian elected leadership, that is, to the Palestinian parliament elected 1996, and to the Arafat leadership, which continues to control the Palestinian Authority in a very lopsided manner until today. So this was the seeds of the rebellion. This was the consequences of the Oslo Agreement, which was negotiated under duress. And this was basically the consequence that led to the maintenance of the current apartheid regime in the West Bank and Gaza. So I will stop here, and maybe we can have a discussion for these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. Now we'll start the next phase. We'll open the space for questions from the public. So we would like, if you have time, to answer them. Mohammed, already questions, let me see, or close. Okay. Let me start myself asking you a question. I will ask to my colleague Mohammed. Can you organize the next one, the next question? Professor Tamari, nowadays all of us know about the Oslo Accords. as a big failure, a big trap prepared by the Israelis against the Palestinians. But if we look back at that time, more than 30 years ago, if you look at the situation in which the PLO was in and the situation of Arafat, what do you think that would be the alternative of signing these accords?
That's a very good question, actually, because you are right. The Palestinian leadership negotiated Oslo under duress, mainly that they were not able, either militarily or politically, to engage Israel in combat so that they can free the land by any other means. And from the point of view of Arafat's leadership and the PLO, the benefits of reaching such an agreement with Israel would allow the bureaucracy and the camp refugees and the political leadership to move back to Palestine, into the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and engage in some kind of civil reconstruction of the Palestinian economy while negotiating peacefully territorial concessions over the issues which were left unaddressed, namely the future of Jerusalem, the future of refugees, the future of settlement, and the borders, which will separate Israel from Palestinian territories. And they had a substantial commitment for that from the Europeans and the US. Russia also signed to this agreement. So at that time, the prospects looked that the Palestinians will gain a breathing space, but also they'll be able to rebuild their economy, and while using both civil disobedience and international pressure to convince the Israelis to come to an agreement. So the prospects actually were favorable to such a vision. However, in answering your question, I think there was a certain degree of latitude by which they could have engaged the Israelis with the consensus of the Americans and the Europeans to at least freeze the settlement activities in the occupied territories while they were discussing final status issues. They did not do that. This was a major failure on their part, which led the Israelis, once the Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by the right-wing forces, to reverse the whole process and make sure that the occupied territories will never accede to independence. So, I mean, these were unseen circumstances, but part of it is due to human failure on the part of the Palestinian leadership, I think, which they should be accountable for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Harari. I have here another question from Isadora Machado. She is asking, what's the difference between the West Bank and occupied Palestine? Are they the same thing, or is occupied Palestine the area where there are only Israelis? Are there refugee camps in the West Bank for those who have had their land stolen by settlers? Are the settlers only in West Bank? I would add another question together with this one. How do you evaluate, how do you compare the situation of the Palestinians who live in what is Israel, properly Israel, and the life of Palestinians in the occupied territories, illegally occupied territories.
Thank you, yes. Well, the term occupied Palestine is used in very different ways. After the Oslo Agreement, the term came to mean the areas occupied in the War of '67, which is Gaza, the West Bank, and the city of Jerusalem. The instrument of occupation was establishment of settlements in various areas in the occupied territories, including the city of Jerusalem. And in Gaza, these settlements were disbanded by Sharon as a result of resistance activities in 2006, so that the only area which became free of settlements was the Gaza Strip, of course, until the October war of last year. The second part of the question is, what's the difference between categories of citizenship? There are three categories. The first one is those Palestinians who remained within the boundaries of the State of Israel after the '48 war, and sometimes they are called Israeli Arabs. They hold Israeli citizenship and they are treated more or less as second-class citizens because they do not have the same access to privileges, to services, to housing rights, and they often continue to have their land and property confiscated. But they have juridical equal citizenship with Israelis. They are subject to the same schooling system, to the same medical services, and they are free to travel basically inside the country and outside it. The second category is people who hold blue identity cards. We differentiate Palestinians by the color of their cards. So the holders of blue Israeli cards are residents of the Golan Heights and the city of Jerusalem. These people are called permanent residents, which means they are not Israeli citizens, they are not free to vote in parliament, but they have permanent residency in their habitat. And they are more privileged than the rest of us, which is the holders of the green cards, which are basically subject to the Palestinian Authority. We have no access to any sovereign territory. We are free to travel, but only by permission. And those people are subject to intense settlement activities, confiscation of land, military arrest, and deportation. So these are the three categories, and it sometimes means that we are all subject to Israeli military rule, but it makes a big difference whether you are a citizen of the state or a colonial subject and part of the Palestinian Authority.
Perfect. Now we have here a question from Bruno Alexandre Reis Costa. He is asking you about the Popular Front of Liberation of Palestine. He wants to know, in your point of view, what was the role of the PFLP in the resistance movement, and why do you think those secular parties decreased while Hamas ascended in the 90s?
That's a very good question. The PFLP was one of three Marxist groups that were quite hegemonic in Palestine after 1967 and up to the 1990s, basically. They were the major left-wing resistance groups in Palestine. There were others. There was the Communist Party, there was the Democratic Front, and other smaller groups. I think after the 82 military defeat in Lebanon, the PFLP began to lose its ability to organize politically, having lost its role as a military force, because the nationalist forces under Arafat controlled all the means of economic support and creating of a parallel state authority. And they found themselves lost between continued call for armed resistance or becoming a parliamentary force in Palestine. And they chose to become a parliamentary force in Palestine. But there is raison d'etre, which is a social agenda, was not able to compete with the Palestinian Authority, who controlled all the resources on the ground. So they continued to be powerful as a political oppositional force, but they lost their raison d'etre as a result of the Oslo Agreement. And they continued to be a major force in Gaza, where they are today part of resistance against Israeli forces, but nothing to compare to their former power, which existed in the 1980s.
Perfect. Now we have a question on the refugees in Palestinian lands. A question from Lisa Marquezine dos Santos. She says, besides the impact in the life of the refugees from 48, what was the impact, social, economic impact, in the Palestinian society after receiving so many refugees in the West Bank and Gaza? So what was the impact of the arrival of new waves of refugees in the Palestinian society that already existed in West Bank and Gaza?
Sorry, you mean the impact of new refugees that arrived from Gaza?
Yes, because before 48, there was a Palestinian society in West Bank and Gaza. And so arrived thousands and thousands of refugees from the lands of what became the state of Israel.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I understand. Yes.
She's talking about that phenomena.
This is a very important question. The impact was different in Gaza from the West Bank. In Transjordan, the refugees became a substantial size of the new urban population, and they occupied very important sectors of the economy. In the West Bank, they were a minority of the population, but they became part of the agricultural and industrial labor force. And in some ways, they enriched the economy because they had substantial skills and sometimes capital. The situation was completely different in Gaza because the poorer refugees went to Gaza. They became the majority of the population. They overran the social fabric of society. And basically, they became marginalized because they had no land and the economy could not sustain them in any meaningful way. And Gaza became a huge, big prison as a result of their influx. So the other important feature of this influx of refugees is that in Syria and Lebanon, they continue to be stateless people, and therefore they constituted the veins, the bulk of the fighting forces of the PLO. In Jordan, however, they became citizens, and they were integrated into the economy. And they became part of the parliamentary system of the Jordanian state, in the same way that they did in the West Bank also. So the difference was quite substantial between Gaza and the West Bank, and between the West Bank and the refugees in Syria and Lebanon.
Professor Salim Tamari, thank you so much. There is another question. Bruno Alexandre Reis Costa. The peace bands and the village league are in any way comparable to today's Palestine role as guarantor of administration of the most crowded centers, also via security coordination with the colonizer?
That's a very tricky question. The peace bands of 37, 38 and the village leagues of 87, 88 were outright collaborators. They were instruments of Israeli control. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank today tries to mediate Israeli rule by pacifying the population. But I think it's wrong to call them collaborators in the sense of the peace bands and the village leagues, because the Palestinian Authority is basically based on the bureaucracy of the PLO and political forces that came with it in 1993. One feature of this authority is that it tries to establish a security force that diffuses and sometimes counters the effect of resistance. But I think it's unfair to call it a collaborating force. It's more better to say it's a mediating force that has failed in its objective of sustaining Palestinian independence from the Israelis. So that failure is short of collaboration, although many people see it as an actual collaborating force in the security sense.
Okay, Professor Tamari, another question from Bruno Alexandre Reis Costa. He asks you, how do you describe the transformations brought by Oslo as part of the difficulty of another intifada to emerge today, from political to economic to security and so on? Have you understood the question?
I think I did. I'll try to answer it and you tell me if I understood it.
Okay.
It's a very important feature of the Oslo Agreement that the Israeli military forces vacated the urban centers and established themselves in the periphery of the West Bank and in Gaza, so that the physical contact between the two populations became insular. And in that, they succeeded in removing the target of civil disobedience in such a way that resistance became much more difficult, because the Israelis began to control the West Bank through checkpoints and foci of resistance, as well as by building a wall separating Israel from the occupied territories in the West Bank. So that wall became a big prison, basically, but at the same time removed the demographic contact between the Israeli military forces and the urban and rural population. So the ability to actually confront, as they did with the Intifada, no longer was the case. And this was a major military success by the Israelis after the Oslo Agreement.
Perfect. I have the last question. I will do it by myself. well, talking about the current situation in Palestine and the situation of the current conflicts, well, what about the so-called two-state solution? Do you think that the two-state solution is still viable?
That's a very good question. I think the possibilities of two states has become not impossible, but it become unforeseeable, basically through the intensive settlement activities, the major confiscation of land, the movement of half a million settlers into the occupied territories, so that the possibility of physical contiguity of the Palestinian Arab population within the occupied territories has become virtually impossible. The only way to reverse this is to relocate the Israeli settlements to zones within Israel or in the periphery of Israel. To do that, you have to overcome the immense gain by the religious nationalist forces of their hegemony in the Israeli state. However, saying that does not mean that the one state is more realizable. There's a one state reality with the colonial state today that renders both the two states or a state of a citizenship almost equally untenable. And what is needed is some time of a major demographic shift that can only happen as a result of political resistance. How this political resistance will happen, we are beginning to witness it today in the current war in Gaza and Lebanon and in the camps and villages of the West Bank. I don't know if this is a satisfactory answer, but this is the way I see it.
Thank you, Professor Salim.
Thank you.
The request was very good, and we hope that the two solution or in a way one solution can be realizable in the future. I think this is the last question, and again we want to say thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you, Ragda. And we are very, very happy. You know, many students are subscriber of our course, and this is something new for us, and even for you, for Birzeit University, it's new, and so that's why we say thank you so much. I give the word to my colleague, Professor Igor, to say also one word.
Obrigado.
Well, I only can say thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture. I'm sure that all of us who are here listening to you, are learning a lot about the question of Palestine. And by this, we have been strengthening our commitment to the Palestinian cause as a cause that has to do not only with the Palestinians and the Arab peoples, but it has to do with the human beings as a struggle for justice, freedom, and peace. Thank you very much. And we are together in the same struggle, together with the Palestinian people. Thank you very much. You helped us a lot.
Great pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Arrivederci.
Thank you so much.